community. The same researchers suggest JFK may have been the first president to be kept from the whole truth.
He was interested in beating the Russians to the moon, but he wasn't interested in space. It was more of a competition type thing. It was a political thing. Johnson, on the other hand, was extremely interested in space.
3 years ago, against such force, the combined destructive power of every battle ever fought by man is like a firecracker thrown against the sun.
Lyndon Baines Johnson first served in the White House as President John Kennedy's vice president. In September 1961, he responded to a letter from a UFO researcher regarding extraterrestrial visitation.
Johnson replied to the letter and said to him, rather than going to the Air Force, he told him to go to the executive secretary at NASA. And it was very strange that he go to NASA, not the Air Force, and very strange that the vice president would be answering UFO mail.
During LBJ's term, military officials were said to have investigated an alleged UFO crash near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. The events of Thursday, December 9th, 1965 remain an important chapter in the history of UFOs and the White House.
There was a recovery team. NASA was identified as being there. Air Force was identified as being there. The object was moved away, and end of story. They said it was a meteorite. That was the official explanation. What I do in a lot of my presidential research is I take major UFO events. I go to the White House records, and then I start looking at who was there. Where was the president? Where was the Secretary of Defense? So anyway, I went to the Johnson Library, and I started looking at where was the president. He was at the ranch in Austin, Texas. The next morning, all the right people seemed to appear at the ranch. For example, James Webb, the head of NASA, flew into the presidential ranch the next morning. The governor of the state of Pennsylvania was there. All the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they have photographs there of them arrived at the ranch. Now, the way they describe the meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff is a Vietnam War meeting. So even though there's nothing that you can actually nail down, the president got pictures of the craft or whatever you want as proof, it did show some circumstantial evidence that something was happening around the president the morning after the crash.
President Richard Milhous Nixon's interest in UFOs is harder to calculate.
I've talked to people who claim they talked to Nixon about UFOs. He was very interested. There was a rumored story that he had a huge UFO book collection, which I was never able to substantiate.
Many UFO researchers believe Nixon received specific briefings, information he may have wanted to take public.
There's some very good indications that he planned to reveal data, that UFOs past, present, and future, a book by Robert Emenegger, a television program that was done with that title. I talked to Emenegger, and he got asked by the Republican Party to produce that show using only government people, because the idea was they were going to release data.
Bob Emenegger was an advertising executive and television producer who happened to know an important man inside the Nixon White House.
Bob Haldeman was someone I knew from UCLA Beta House, which is a fraternity. Then, as you know, he went on to be chief of staff under Nixon.
In the mid-1970s, Emenegger and his partner researched military stories for their TV production at Norton Air Force Base's film archives.
Paul Shartle is the one who took us in there and said, what would you think if we told you we had a landing at Holloman Air Force Base of an alien craft, and it was filmed by our TDY, our temporary duty guys, and the film was sent here to Norton, where all films usually are sent. And I thought, this sounds outrageous, that, UFOs and all. He said, well, look, if you're interested, check with the Pentagon, but bury those under those other projects because it's a red flag to get into the subject of UFOs. George Weinbrenner was the commander of foreign technology. He has a private bunker down at Wright-Patterson. I went down the long hall. I could see all the little cameras, surveillance cameras. Walked right up to his desk and said, I want to ask you, what about the landing of an alien craft at Holloman Air Force Base? And I sort of expected him to say, what? The what? He didn't. So he reached up, pulled out a book, handed it to me. So I opened the book up and it said, to my friend, Colonel George Weinbrenner, signed Dr. Alan Hynek. And the book was all on UFOs. Well, Hynek was the scientific advisor to the Air Force at that time on UFOs.
Perplexed, Emenegger contacted his friend and Nixon's chief of staff, Bob Haldeman.
He was at the White House, and I asked if he had heard anything about the landing at Holloman Air Force Base, and he said, well, I heard something, but I don't know. Whether the president knew, I have no idea.
While Emenegger never obtained the Holloman film for the 1974 nationally broadcast program, his first-hand experience provides researchers insight on what American presidents may have known about UFOs.
A friend of mine helping me out talked to two ex-presidents. They both confirmed that they had been shown the Holloman Air Force Base film.
Congress should investigate the rash of reported sightings of unidentified flying objects in southern Michigan and other parts of the country.
Gerald R. Ford had shown interest in the UFO subject as a congressman due to sightings by people in his district during the 1960s.
What a lot of people don't realize is that the primary function of a congressman is to serve his constituents. So Jerry, out of service to his constituents, saw to it that there would be a hearing.
So Gerald Ford went to the bat for the people who wanted an answer. And he made a lot of very, very strong statements saying that he wanted a congressional investigation.
On April 5th, 1966, the House Armed Services Committee held public hearings on the subject of unidentified flying objects. Air Force Secretary Harold Brown concluded,
we have not been hiding anything. The investigations have been made public. The hearing this morning was public for just that reason.
It's unknown whether the hearings actually had an impact on Ford's view of UFOs after becoming president. But many researchers maintain Ford selected advisors who showed an understanding of the potential threat posed by UFOs.
He had some advisors who, at the time, may not have been all that important. There was Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. Had George Bush Sr. as his CIA director, had some people who he could trust and who could trust him.
After leaving the White House, Ford replied to a letter from a former Air Force intelligence officer who researched UFOs. During my public career in Congress as Vice President and President, I made various requests for information on UFOs. The official authorities always denied the UFO allegations.
As President, Ford said nothing on this topic. So you can either think someone got to him or he just lost interest, but I think more likely he decided it wasn't politically prudent to discuss this matter.
Coming up, some presidents put all politics aside once they had their own UFO encounters. While there are some documents connecting UFOs in the White House and a few reports that presidents may have seen them, there's only one public admission. President Jimmy Carter was the first commander-in-chief to admit to seeing a UFO.
Carter was known as UFO president because he actually talked about his sighting. A UFO group had contacted him, wrote him a letter and said, could you fill out our sighting report? Jimmy Carter filled out the sighting report, and the rest is history.
Well, Carter himself said the incident happened in October of 1969 when he was down in Leary, Georgia, speaking at a Lions Club. He spoke very strongly about it. And one thing I think it also is very impressive to the public is the fact that Carter was a state legislator here in Georgia when he saw the sighting, and he went on record about it and spoke of it quite publicly. And even becoming governor and then later becoming president, he's never waffled on it. He's always been quite upfront about it. Yes, I saw something, and no, it was not. I could not identify it.
I don't make fun of people who say they've seen unidentified objects in the sky.
He'll always say that he can associate with people who have had the experience, that he would never laugh at anybody who's had a UFO sighting because he's experienced it himself.
Carter's UFO report gives a vivid account of what he saw that night.
I never have tried to identify what I saw. It was, a light in the western sky. It was very unique. I never seen it before. So there were about 20 of us who saw it.
Carter said the object he saw was, had firm edges. It was circular. It seemed self-luminous. It was about 1,000 yards away, and it retreated, and then it came forward, and then it left. Basically, when you talk about UFOs, people look at you strangely, and for that reason, I think a lot of people would not be willing to be like Carter and go on the line and actually fill out a report.
And he's never disavowed the content of his report, which tells me that Jimmy Carter, just as honest as a man as you'll ever find in or out of government, has left that bit of legacy to be savored by future UFO researchers who can point to it as a milestone in the fact that the government does know more than it has been telling about the subject. And this was enough inspiration for Jimmy to try to funnel out some of that knowledge.
While running for the presidency, Carter made campaign promises that he would release all he could about UFOs once he took office.
Well, no, but I would, make information that we have about those sightings available to the public at any time.
And how did they try to hold Jimmy Carter to his promise? They wrote letters to him as soon as he got in office saying, Jimmy, you're now where you can fulfill your promise, please do so.
As many as 9,000 UFO-related letters from citizens reached the White House during Carter's term.
Naturally, he didn't answer it all himself, hardly any of it, but there were many people, some of them were interested in the follow-up to that 1976 promise, and others were just interested in telling their own little experience where they might have seen something that they wanted to go on record.
But some researchers suggest other reasons why Carter may not have been able to deliver on his campaign promise.
The CIA comes in and briefs the president on the most important intelligence stuff. And the person who briefed Jimmy Carter on the intelligence matters was George Bush Sr., the CIA director. Jimmy Carter asked for the UFO file. The story was that George Bush said, you don't have a need to know. This works on a need to know, and curiosity on the part of the president isn't sufficient need to know.
To those who claim that George Bush was briefing Carter on UFOs, I think the burden of the proof would be on them. I mean, there were other much more likely subjects for them to be talking about.
Regardless, President Carter did release UFO-related documents during his administration. The UFO community considers it the golden years.
Half of all the UFO documents, there's thousands of UFO documents that have been released under the Freedom of Information Act request over the last 30 or 40 years. Over half of them were released under 4 years of Jimmy Carter.
These newly declassified documents were sourced from numerous agencies. They contain information about many UFO sightings and the military responses. Access to the declassified material continues to bolster UFO research.
We must act today in order to preserve tomorrow. And let there be no misunderstanding. We are going to begin to act.
There are reports that Ronald Reagan had 2 UFO experiences prior to serving as president. The story of his first sighting reached the public through the memoirs of actress Lucille Ball. She recalled that Reagan and wife Nancy arrived late to a Hollywood party.
And she stated that when Mr. Reagan and Nancy arrived at the party, they were all excited. They told everybody about this sighting, that this thing they had seen it coming down the coast. They had watched this whole thing.
Ronald Reagan was very interested in the topic of UFOs, privately, very much so. And indeed, has been said to have seen one while flying on an aircraft as governor of California. Apparently a very interesting sighting.